25 years ago, the producers of Star Trek did something that they hadn't done before and have rarely done since. They tried to do something different. They succeeded, and in the minds of many fans, including myself, the result was the best Star Trek series of them all. So now, to mark the 25th anniversary, here are 5 ways Deep Space Nine defied expectations and reinvented Star Trek. Number 1, it turned the classic premise upside down. The original Star Trek, the movies it spawned, and its first spin-off, The Next Generation, all shared the same basic premise, which was expressed so memorably in their opening narrations: to boldly go where no one had gone before. Deep Space Nine, on the other hand, particularly in its earlier seasons, was a lot more stationary than was typical for Star Trek. And I just realized that's a pun. Stationary. I'm sorry about that. I hope you don't find it too off-putting. But you know what? Even if you do, hey, why don't you try writing one of these? You know? You think it's so easy? Moving right along, whereas previously Star Trek had been based on ships carrying out missions of exploration, Deep Space Nine was set at a galactic crossroads with people from throughout the quadrant, and thanks to a wormhole discovered in the pilot episode, across the galaxy, coming and going on the space station, bringing all sorts of drama and intrigue along with them. In fact, being at a crossroads was a central theme of Deep Space Nine when it began. The lead protagonist, Benjamin Sisko, was still grieving the death of his wife and considering leaving Starfleet altogether. The people of nearby Bajor were just beginning to rebuild their society following a long and brutal military occupation by the Cardassians. Almost everywhere you looked, characters and entire cultures were grappling with choices that would shape their futures. And there to wring every last drop of drama out of those choices and the many conflicts that surrounded them was arguably the finest collection of performers to ever step onto a Star Trek soundstage. Number 2, its cast was large and diverse. When Deep Space Nine premiered, a lot of attention was focused on the casting of Avery Brooks, who became the first African-American actor to lead a Star Trek series. And rightly so. Not only did the casting of Brooks as Commander Sisko carry on Star Trek's tradition of inclusion and representation, it also signaled that Deep Space Nine would be speaking with its own voice, or rather, voices. More so than any other Star Trek show, Deep Space Nine was an ensemble piece. If you include both regulars and recurring characters, it was the largest cast of any Star Trek show, full of conflicted heroes, complicated villains, and some who didn't quite fit into either of those categories. In this show, not all of the good guys wore Starfleet uniforms. In fact, some of the bad guys did. And at the center of it all, embodying the tarnished but tireless heroism that would become one of the series' most enduring hallmarks, was Sisko. Eventually promoted from commander to captain, Benjamin Sisko became Star Trek's version of Odysseus. Parent and child, spouse and friend, commander and comrade, prophet and believer. A complete person, the most fully realized character in the history of the franchise. And as it was with Sisko the character, so it was with the show. By the time the series ended, Deep Space Nine had become the richest, most colorful, most varied, most interesting location in all of Trek lore. And how did the show accomplish this? Number 3, it changed the way Star Trek stories were told. More than any other Trek series, with the recent exception of the newest entry in the franchise, Star Trek Discovery, Deep Space Nine embraced serialized storytelling. Unlike TNG or the original series before it or Voyager after it, the creators of Deep Space Nine produced their series on the assumption that viewers would be watching more than one episode, that fans of the show would be willing to not only follow a story through multiple installments, but willing to watch characters change and grow as the show progressed, rather than remaining relatively static. Benjamin Sisko is a very different person in the final episode than he is in the premiere. So are Kira, Odo, Bashir, O'Brien, Jake Sisko, Quark, even Worf, who doesn't join the cast until the 4th season. Of course, there's Dax, who is literally a new person by the end of the series. Not only do the characters change, their relationships change, grow, and deepen as well. We watch Bashir and O'Brien go from strangers to best friends. We meet Dukat as a foil for Sisko and Kira, see him go from enemy to uneasy ally, and flirt with redemption before ultimately becoming one of the darkest villains in all of the franchise. We see Worf and Dax's initial flirtation grow into romance and marriage before meeting a tragic end. By the way, is Worf the Sipowicz of Star Trek or what? Deep Space Nine really establishes him as the designated sufferer when he arrives, which I'm sure was a welcome development from where O'Brien was standing. He was probably like, hey, maybe the writers will stop slapping me around so much. Think again, Miles. O'Brien must suffer! Anyway, not only did Deep Space Nine bring us more complex stories that sometimes took longer than 1 or 2 episodes to tell, and the most dynamic characters of any Star Trek cast, the series was also constantly finding ways of reinventing itself. Number 4, it evolved throughout its run. The quality of Deep Space Nine was fairly consistent throughout most of its 7-season run, which is all the more impressive when you consider how often the show was retooled. For its first 2 seasons, the show centered on Bajor and its complicated relationship with Cardassia. In the 3rd season, the station got its own ship, the USS Defiant, which was awesome, and the focus began to shift from the struggles of Bajor to a looming conflict with the Dominion, the mysterious power from the other side of the wormhole, led by shape-shifting changelings who, it was feared, were infiltrating the highest levels of the Federation. In Season 4, Worf showed up, and there was a brief detour into a conflict with the Klingons. Then at the end of Season 5, the Dominion invades the Alpha Quadrant, and the war between the Federation and the Dominion becomes the main storyline for the rest of the series. Amazingly, the creators of Deep Space Nine were able to maintain the show's core identity throughout these changes, so that it didn't feel like the series was being constantly tinkered with so much as it felt like it was willing to shake up the status quo, to go beyond previously drawn boundaries and explore new territory. And the stories told through those explorations often had quite a bit to say about life in our own world. Number 5, it was pointedly political. Star Trek has been around so long and taken so many forms that fans gravitate to it for different reasons. Personally, I prefer my Star Trek progressive and preachy. So it's no wonder that I love Deep Space Nine so much. In fact, I reckon Deep Space Nine was the most overtly political Star Trek since the original series. Sure, TNG got up on its soapbox plenty of times too. Some of its best episodes were heavy with social commentary. The Drumhead, The Outcast, The Measure of a Man, Chain of Command, to name only a few. But Deep Space Nine didn't merely produce a thinly veiled allegory every so often. Its politics were baked into the original premise of the show. Remember, the whole reason Starfleet took over the station and sent Commander Sisko there in the first place was to help Bajor rebuild following the end of a decades-long occupation by the Cardassians that had left millions of Bajorans dead. Because the Bajorans are so closely identified with their religion and the Cardassian government is so unmistakably fascist, it's tempting to read the occupation as an allegory for the Holocaust, which you can definitely do. But the truth is, history is so full of powerful nations exploiting less powerful ones that the occupation can stand for any number of things. British imperialism, Soviet domination of Eastern Europe following World War II, take your pick. The writers of DS9 certainly did. And beyond stories like Duet, Progress, or Indiscretion that explored various consequences of the occupation, Deep Space Nine produced episodes like Past Tense that has Sisko, Dax, and Bashir accidentally transported back in time to 21st century San Francisco, where they come face to face with the disastrous results of unaddressed economic inequality. or Far Beyond the Stars, which deals with the subject of racism more directly than any other Star Trek episode before or since. Of course, DS9 also had its lighter moments, and many episodes that were more about action, suspense, or building characters than delivering a message. But taken as a whole, from first episode to last, it's pretty difficult to miss the fact that Deep Space Nine was almost always about something other than the story it was presenting on the surface. It wasn't just a show about humans and aliens living together on a space station or having fantastic adventures throughout the galaxy. It had things to say, not just about the imaginary world it depicted, but about the world in which it was created. Our world. And by showing us characters struggling with problems that mirrored our own, it reminded us that while there's no such thing as a perfect world, it's always possible to make a better world. And if that ain't the essence of Star Trek, I don't know what is. The hardest part is picking only 5. Catch you next time.